So welcome back to another episode of Simon Says, and today we have Lyra here with us.
Yep. Hello.
And we just want to continue what we started off last week, talking about just different topics that are related to the political compass survey and discussion that we had. And we talked about big versus small government the week before, and today we want to talk about federal versus state government. Now, this is something I think had attracted a lot of interest, especially in Malaysia, and in light of all the discussion about the East Malaysian state wanting more rights, or some even wanting the independence from the federation. So what comes to your mind when we talk about federal versus state?
Well, I think one of the very things that I thought of is, does federal government naturally mean bigger government or smaller government for that matter? So does that mean that more rights to the state means smaller federal government? So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just from Malaysian perspective, I think we have talked a few times already, even in this show, how our federal government is really, really a big government. And compared to all the other federal government in the world, we are not lacking in terms of the bigness, in terms of the domination. So in a general sense, I think because federal government deals with other nations and in the increasing landscape of globalizations, I think your initial statement, I believe, is a correct one, that federal government tends to be a more big government expression, whereas state government and even local government, they tend to deal with day-to-day living lifestyle kind of issues.
So does that mean that it's kind of like going back to the Jeffersonian model, whereby the federal, yes, you do what your necessary thing, like a weaker national government. So basically the federal will control, like cutting taxes, cutting the deficit of the nation debt, whereas state, like what you say, they take care of the day-to-day kind of errands. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the foundation of a nation. Like Malaysia, we were just discussing before the recording, how our constitution actually divided the federal and state powers quite clearly. And I remember many legal commentators, they said, look, this model in 1957 was considered extremely innovative because like the American model, the Australian model, even the United Kingdom model, etc., they sort of have division, but it's not so clear-cut. It was through practice, custom, tradition, history, and even court cases after a while. But whereas we have a clear division, and that was that is something you can find in Schedule 9 of our Constitution. And since we're at that, we might as well just look at the list, right?
Yep.
And okay, maybe you want to read the federal list, then I can read the state list, and then we can compare how different they are.
Sure. So federal, you have external affairs, whereby you basically have all these treaties, agreements, and all these conventions with other countries, diplomatic sort of trade representation. But you also have defense of the federation, basically. You have internal security. So this is where you have the police, the prison, the preventive detention, intelligence services, national registration comes here as well. Then you also have like civil and criminal law, and all this procedural and also administration of justice. And then you have federal citizenship, naturalizations, the machinery of the government. That's interesting because it talks about the election to both houses of parliament and also the legislative assembly of the states. Then you also have the armed forces council that comes here as well. The federal government contracts, that's something that is quite interesting, I thought. Then you also have finance. I think when people think of finance, linking to federal, naturally, what comes into your mind is Ministry of Finance, MOF Incorporated.
And by the way, finance includes all the tax revenue.
Yep.
So that's an extremely powerful federal right, I would say.
Yep. And of course, like trade, commerce, industry comes here as well. Shipping, navigation, fisheries, communication, transport. It's a long, long list. You also have education.
Health.
Yes. All this come here. And then labor and social security. So these are a long, long list of what comes under the federal list. I mean, I'm not talking about the whole thing, but this is a lot. Like you have at least 27 items that are listed here.
Actually, when I first kind of check the list, and I'm not quite sure the history, if this list has been amended since 1957, I think there will be something interesting to find out, because just on this list, and we're going to read the state list in a while, it already shows such imbalance, right? That the federal is like totally dominating the states. I mean, we don't talk about practice, we don't talk about operation, just from the constitutional point of view.
Yeah, but I think also another thing to be considered as well is during the formation of Malaysia, does this list change, Because obviously earlier on, we know that with the formation of Malaya, you have those states coming together, forming that federation. But when you have three equal partners that come in together, Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak, shouldn't the list change? Or
now, Schedule 9, if you see, there is some kind of addition to Sabah and Sarawak. So they do add certain rights for them, but it's not massive. It is more like in terms of their customary rights, certain land rights, but the federal list remains the same. So that's why I also want to go back and see whether this was the original list. But based on the way the constitution can be changed, it's not easy. You need 2/3 of the House. But then again, the coalition, the alliance and the Barisan Nasional always had 2/3 until the last couple of Gs, So I mean, they could easily change, but it will be interesting to find out. Now let's read the state list, okay? And it's not very long, okay? So obviously we know in general that states, their biggest bargaining power will be land. So land includes all the dealing, the transfer, the registrations, mortgage, so everything related to land affairs. So that's probably their biggest trump card. And from there you get site land matter like Malay reserve land, native reserve land in Sabah and Sarawak. So you have those kind of things. Religion, very interesting religion. But one of the things that I find interesting especially during the lockdown, remember the house of worship, who can determine the SOP. And for non-Islam house of worship, apparently it's under the legal department of Prime Minister office. But I guess maybe that's because we're in Wilayah, I'm not sure. But it seems like the whole Klang Valley was under that for a while.
But this whole thing came into perspective even before the emergency was being declared. So it's kind of interesting because that is kind of like going directly against the list that is being stated here in Schedule 9.
Yeah, I mean, the whole COVID kind of thing, it was based on infectious health, prevention of health, infection disease kind of act. So it's based on a very, very tiny act, and then all of a sudden you give the local health authority so much power to enforce and compound, and even the way you can gather. And I mean, this is something that people want to just say, okay, move on, forget about it. But it is very alarming, because how can you have this kind of power now? Of course, later on, you have emergency, you have National Security Council, even that act, NSC act, we talk about in this show, it is really giving so much power to that committee. It's a bit like Razak's NOC kind of power, right? During the May 13. But anyway, land, local government, interesting, local government is under states, but we have been saying that local government should be separate from state. It should be something else, because it's really even more day to day. Estate guardianship, agricultural, forestry, I mean, that's about it. I mean, natural resources is a bit of both. And then we have a joint list, right? Joint list, which is supposedly both federal and state have power to kind of step in. So social welfare, scholarship, culture, sports, etc., etc. Now, we don't want to talk too much on that, because I think you can read yourself, Schedule 9. But we have said, look, your first question, do we think of federal as big government? I already say, yes, I think so. But can you give maybe some example, at least in Malaysia, how that kind of translates into the reality and history, perhaps?
I think one of the thing is the just how much control the Prime Minister office has. Because naturally, I think Malaysia has always had big government, like what we have alluded very beginning of this episode. But it's just alarming to find that we have so much power that is vested in one person's hand. Because we have always been talking about the Prime Minister being first among equals.
Yep.
And yet you see that there's so much power that is really vested within the Prime Minister office. And now you also have like our Prime Minister, the 10th Prime Minister, that is also holding a position that is linked to Ministry of Finance.
Yep.
So I think based on all these things, it's not surprising to think that the whole design of this government is just basically geared towards a much bigger cabinet, a much bigger control that is really just being controlled by the federal level rather than the state.
Now, one of the things that we want to highlight here is if you read the constitutions, when they mention federal power, they are talking about the lawmaking power. But of course, when we talk about federal power, we are mostly talking about, yes, the parliament is federal, but for the longest time, the expression of power doesn't come from parliament. It really comes from the executive, from the cabinet, from prime minister. And then, of course, you have, judiciary was sort of crippled already since the end of 80s, And then we talk about opposition. There's no meaningful federal opposition until maybe the last couple of GE. So the Alliance, Barisan Nasional basically have free hands. Basically the entire of Dr. Mahathir's first tenure and before. They could do anything they want. And we talked already previously, that's how we came into the 1MDB situation. But that's not even all the scandal and bailout. So many cases we can think of, right? Mas, Perwaja, etc., etc. And so that's the whole thing. Now recently, have you been reading the news? And now one of the positions that kind of captured a lot of attention was the MACC commissioner, and I think the other day Prime Minister was saying that, look, I have no objection if Parliament is going to determine. Do you think it will come to that Parliament will have the decision making? That will be something quite revolutionary for a Westminster system.
Indeed. Definitely looking forward to. It's just something that is mind-boggling, to be honest. But I think, like what you say, it would be very interesting because previously, I think MSCC is answerable to Prime Minister.
Yep.
Although they are supposedly independent.
Yeah, supposedly, and I think even at one stage it was under AG Chambers because they are all kind of, they're sort of like the public prosecutor. But then MSCC, I think one of the goal is they want to be like the Hong Kong version of MSCC. And of course, if you know the history, was the corruption of police and other authority going up to the highest level. Then the United Kingdom government has to set up something that has power to investigate everyone. As I can't remember what is the chief of Hong Kong already. There's the title.
The inspector something. I think.
No, not the police. The governmental chief.
Oh, wow! I forgot.
It is a bit like prime minister. They're not prime minister, so it's like their anti-corruption agency could investigate everyone except the head representative. So that's the thing, and we're heading there, but this is just the history of our nations, that the dominations of federal power. Now you talk about the Jefferson's model, right? And I think it's interesting to compare and contrast, because Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, actually fought for state right. And he was having a huge debate with the Federalists. So Federalists, there are many leaders, but one of the most famous, Alexander Hamilton. So they fought, but eventually Jefferson prevailed.
Yep.
And he basically argued, look, the federal government should be limited to do what it needs to do in terms of dealing with other nations. Now, he was the president when America bought Louisiana, which is one of the biggest foreign deal in the world ever. I mean, Louisiana, that time, represent 1/3 of the entire United States. And I think they were just calculating one acre of land will cost a few cents only. So that was huge. But besides all these major deals, he really kept his words, and the state has many powers. So, I mean, if we look at the American model, the federal government was not beat until the last 100 years.
Yep.
So I guess what we were saying in the beginning is it's not mutually exclusive. It could be that you have federal government that's small, but of course in this globalization age, it is just so difficult to find one that. I mean, can you think of any government that has a small federal? I mean, in the federation model. I mean, we're not talking about confederation model like Emirates like that. Emirates is more like city states. You have Abu Dhabi, you have Dubai. I think the city governor has more power than the overall prime minister, maybe.
Yeah, I can't really think of any though.
And when I was researching this, and that's where I found the term confederation. And it's interesting that I was trying to find a modern confederation today, and the closest I could find was UAE. And it's interesting because during Civil War, remember the South decided to call themselves Confederate.
Yep.
Because in their mind, Confederate is not federation, and it gives them the free right to leave the Union. So that was how America was before the Independence War. That was how Australia was before all the different colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, before they decided to become one nation. And that's probably how the states were in Malaysia. We have the Negeri Bersekutu and the Non-Bersekutu. They have their own different coalitions. So, yeah, I mean, at those times, they can choose to leave. Some become straight settlement, Malacca, Penang, Singapore, but others, the Sultan kind of have, now, of course, they were almost like just nominal power at that time. So, I guess the terminology is not so important. It is the substance, right? How you actually do it.
I guess, do you reckon that, especially after post 9/11, then all these things sort of change, because then certain things just fall under the preview of federal, because all in the name of security. After that, federal will just naturally have to take over all this right to basically have like surveillance, then just start to intrude into people's privacy.
Yeah, I think 9/11 definitely was a major one. And then, of course, COVID. And these two really gave federal power tremendous power. And I guess the question at the end of the day is how much interference you want, right?
Yep.
And unfortunately, we have spoken to people who will be like, rule me, govern me, tell me what to do. But you and I, we don't want that, right?
No, not at all.
Now, our time is almost up, but let's just quickly talk about, now we have looked at the federal list, the state list. Now, what are some of the powers, federal powers, that you think should be state power or even local government power?
Education,
and
even health, I believe. Because
why so?
Well, education, you just look at what is happening in the States right now. I mean, why do we need to have a centralized curriculum all across Malaysia? I mean, you have seen that certain states, I mean, the joke on all Malaysians is that when we go for public exams, then you just need to like do the bare minimum, then you pass through the threshold.
Yep.
But what sets the standard then? Because if the standard, the bar is so low, basically you have to go under the lowest denominator that there is. Then after that, you don't produce quality students, you don't produce quality graduates, and who are you to blame at the end of the day?
I've heard very credible report that say like SPM, the passing mark for average passing mark for each subject is 20 mark.
That's super low.
Because I mean, if you follow the result, every year they say it's an improvement, right? But then you look at the quality of the available graduates, it's not going up, it's going down,
Yep.
I mean, in terms of language and things like that. So something is really off there. Okay, what?
I think also going back to education, there's also the language as well. the medium of language that is being used, like English or BM, then I think the federal has always been like flip-flopping,
Yep.
changing between the two. Then after that, at the end of the day, the students are confused.
So now Sarawak say official language is English. So we should let the states decide. If you want an English education, then you go to the state. But of course, that's a different topic. You know, are you able to move between states? You know, you can't just go to Sarawak and Sabah and say you are a naturalized citizen for those places because of MA 63, etc. But in the United States, in Australia, you can, for example. Any other, I mean, maybe think of another area that you think is better as a
Health?
state? Health?
Yeah, I mean, of course.
Yeah, I mean, with COVID, we see a little bit of that. Right? I remember with Sarawak, they had the SDMC doing their own. So it's a bit of decentralization, I would say. I mean, from Najib to Mahathir to the interim prime minister, I don't even want to mention the name, and then now to Anwar, I feel like there has been a shift from federal to states in terms of reducing the big government centralization. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely that sort of shift, but I hope to see a much more definitive sort of reform that is really coming from our prime minister.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, our time is out, but one of the topic that we will discuss in the next round related to big versus small government, related to federal and state, is really the whole topic on self-determination.
Yep.
So that will be out in the next episode.
Yes.
So that's it for now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.